The morning sun was shining bright over the huge factory grounds of one of the biggest farm equipment companies in the country. Today was special, very special. The company's big boss, a man who had worked his way up from nothing to become the head of this massive business, was getting ready for the most important day of the year. This wasn't just any ordinary day. Today, they were showing off their brand new machine to some of the richest people in the farming world. People who could buy hundreds of these machines with just one phone call. People whose money could make or break the company's future. Drio. Big Boss had been planning this day for months. Everything had to be perfect. The machine they were showing was worth more money than most people see in their entire lives. It was packed with the latest technology, computers and special parts that could do the work of 20 people in half the time. Workers had been polishing every inch of the giant machine since early morning. The paint was so shiny, you could see your face in it. All the metal parts sparkled like jewelry. Even the tires were scrubbed clean until they looked brand new. The company had spent millions making this machine, and today was the day to prove it was worth every penny. People started arriving around 10 in the morning. Fancy cars pulled up one after another. Men and women in expensive suits stepped out looking around at the impressive factory buildings. These weren't regular farmers. These were people who owned huge farming businesses. People who bought equipment worth millions of dollars every year. The big boss greeted each visitor personally. He shook hands, smiled big smiles, and made sure everyone felt welcome. His heart was beating fast, but he tried to look calm and confident. He knew that in the next few hours he would either make the biggest deal of his career or watch everything fall apart. The demonstration area was set up like a small stadium. Chairs were arranged in perfect rows, all facing toward where the big machine waited. A microphone was set up so everyone could hear clearly. Banners hung everywhere showing the company's logo and pictures of their best equipment. As more people arrived, the excitement in the air grew stronger. Workers whispered to each other about how important this day was. The company's future depended on impressing these visitors. If they liked what they saw, orders worth hundreds of millions of dollars could come flooding in. The big boss looked at his watch. It was almost time to start. He straightened his tie, took a deep breath, and walked toward the microphone. Behind him, the massive machine sat waiting, looking like a sleeping giant ready to wake up and show its power. Around 50 people had gathered in the demonstration area. Some were taking pictures with their phones. Others were talking quietly among themselves, pointing at different parts of the machine. A few were already taking notes, getting ready to ask tough questions. The big boss tapped the microphone to make sure it was working. The sound echoed across the area, and everyone turned to look at him. This was his moment. Everything he had worked for led to this single presentation. He began speaking, his voice strong and confident. He talked about how many years the company had been in business. He explained how they had always been leaders in making the best farm equipment. He told stories about farmers whose lives had been changed by their machines. Then he started talking about the new machine behind him. His eyes lit up as he described all its amazing features. It could plant seeds, water them, and even check the soil to make sure crops would grow perfectly. It had cameras that could spot problems before humans could see them. It could work day and night without getting tired. The visitors listened carefully. Some nodded their heads, looking impressed. Others asked smart questions that showed they really understood farming and machinery. The big boss answered each question perfectly, showing off how much he knew about his product. Everything was going exactly as planned. The presentation was smooth, the audience was interested, and the machine looked absolutely perfect sitting there in the sunshine. The big boss felt confident that this was going to be the best day in his company's history. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. It was time to actually turn on the machine and show what it could do. The big boss walked over to the control panel, his hand hovering over the start button. The crowd leaned forward in their chairs, cameras ready to record the demonstration. He pressed the button with a big smile on his face. The machine's engine roared to life, making a deep, powerful sound that echoed across the factory grounds. The big boss felt a rush of pride as he watched his creation come alive. For the first few minutes, everything worked perfectly. The machine moved forward smoothly, its huge wheels rolling over the demonstration ground. All the computer screens lit up, showing colorful displays of information. The crowd watched in amazement as the machine performed one task after another, each one more impressive than the last. The big boss spoke into his microphone, explaining what everyone was seeing. He pointed out special features and talked about how much time and money farmers could save. Some visitors were already pulling out their phones, probably calling their offices to talk about placing orders. But then, without any warning, something went wrong. Very wrong. The machine's smooth humming suddenly changed to a rough, grinding noise. Black smoke started pouring out from under the hood. Warning lights began flashing red all over the control panel. The crowd gasped as the massive machine shuddered and jerked like it was in pain. The big boss's smile disappeared instantly. His face went white as he frantically pushed buttons on the control panel, trying to figure out what was happening. The grinding noise got louder and louder. More smoke billowed out, creating a dark cloud that drifted over the worried crowd. Within seconds, the impressive machine that had been running perfectly just moments before came to a complete stop. The engine made a few final coughing sounds, and then went completely silent. The only sound left was the gentle hissing of steam rising from somewhere inside the machine. The big boss stood frozen at the control panel, staring at all the red warning lights. His mind was racing, trying to understand what had just happened. This was supposed to be the perfect demonstration. This was supposed to be the day that changed everything for his company. Instead, he was standing in front of 50 of the most important people in the farming industry, watching his million-dollar machine sitting there like a giant, expensive paperweight. Some visitors were already whispering to each other. Others were checking their phones, probably getting ready to leave. The big boss grabbed his radio and called for his best engineers. His voice was shaking as he tried to stay calm while speaking into the microphone. He told the crowd that they were just experiencing a small technical problem that would be fixed in just a few minutes. But as the minutes passed, it became clear that this wasn't a small problem at all. The company's top engineers arrived and immediately started checking different parts of the machine. They opened panels, looked at computer screens, and tested various systems. But nothing they tried seemed to work. The crowd was getting restless. Some people started looking at their watches. Others began talking about other appointments they had that day. The big boss could see his dream slipping away right in front of his eyes. 1 hour passed, then another. The engineers were stumped. They had never seen this kind of problem before. The machine's computer systems were working fine, but something was preventing all the mechanical parts from working together properly. The big boss was sweating now, even though the morning air was still cool. He kept apologizing to the crowd, promising that they would figure out the problem soon. But he could see that people were losing patience. Some had already gotten up from their chairs and were walking back toward their cars. Just when things seemed like they couldn't get any worse, the big boss noticed something that made him even more frustrated. At the edge of the crowd, standing quietly by himself, was a young man who clearly didn't belong there. The teenager was wearing old work clothes that had seen better days. His boots were muddy and his hands showed the signs of someone who worked hard with them every day. He definitely wasn't one of the wealthy visitors who had come to see the demonstration. The boy was watching everything with interest, but he wasn't taking pictures or asking questions like everyone else. He just stood there quietly, observing the broken machine and the frustrated engineers trying to fix it. The big boss felt a wave of irritation wash over him. Here he was, facing the worst moment of his career, and some random farm kid was just standing there watching like it was free entertainment. Didn't the boy understand how serious this situation was? Didn't he realize that millions of dollars and hundreds of jobs were at stake? Looking at the young man in his simple clothes, the big boss made a decision that he would later realize was one of the biggest mistakes of his life. With frustration and embarrassment boiling over inside him, he decided to make a comment that he thought would be funny but would actually change everything. The big boss looked at the young man standing at the edge of the crowd and felt his anger rising. Everything was falling apart around him, and this farm kid was just standing there like he was watching a movie. The most important day of his business. Life was turning into a disaster, and he needed someone to blame. Without thinking about what he was saying, the big boss grabbed his microphone and spoke in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear. His words came out sharp and filled with frustration. "Well, since my top engineers can't figure this out," he said, pointing toward the young man, "maybe the farm boy over there should take a look. He's probably used to fixing broken tractors with tape and wire." A few people in the crowd chuckled, nervously. Others looked uncomfortable at the harsh tone in the big boss's voice. The expensive visitors shifted in their seats, not sure what to make of this sudden outburst. This wasn't the professional presentation they had expected. The young man didn't seem upset by the comment. Instead, he looked directly at the big boss with calm, steady eyes. There was something in his expression that wasn't what anyone expected. He didn't look embarrassed or angry. He looked like someone who had heard worse things before and knew exactly how to handle them. "Actually," the teenager said in a clear, confident voice that carried across the demonstration area, "I'd be happy to take a look." The crowd went quiet. Even the engineers stopped what they were doing and turned to watch. Nobody had expected the young man to actually respond to the challenge. Most people would have walked away or gotten angry. But this kid was stepping forward, like he actually meant it. The big boss felt his face getting hot. He had been trying to make a joke to ease the tension, but now the situation was getting even more awkward. The last thing he needed was some random teenager making things worse by pretending he could fix a $1 million machine that professional engineers couldn't figure out. "Look, kid," the big boss said, trying to sound nicer but still wanting the young man to just go away. "This isn't a simple tractor. This is advanced technology. It has computer systems that took years to develop. You really don't need to worry about it." But the teenager was already walking toward the broken machine. He moved with purpose, like he knew exactly what he was doing. The crowd watched in silence as he approached the massive piece of equipment that had stumped everyone else. The young man walked slowly around the entire machine, looking at it from every angle. He wasn't rushing or trying to show off. He was studying it the way someone studies a puzzle they're determined to solve. His eyes moved over every part, every wire, every connection. The engineers watched him with mixture of curiosity and annoyance. They had spent years studying machines like this. They had college degrees and decades of experience. The idea that some kid in work clothes could see something they had missed seemed impossible. But as they watched, something interesting started to happen. The young man wasn't just looking at the machine randomly. He was examining it in a very specific way, starting with the power systems and moving through each connected part in logical order. His approach was methodical and smart. After walking around the machine twice, the teenager stopped and looked up at the big boss. "Do you have some basic tools I could borrow?" he asked politely. "Just simple stuff like wrenches and screwdrivers." The big boss almost laughed. Here was this kid asking for simple tools when the company's engineers had been using advanced diagnostic equipment for hours. But something about the young man's confidence made him hesitate. Against his better judgment, he nodded to one of the workers to bring a basic toolbox. The teenager rolled up his sleeves and got to work. He didn't waste time talking or explaining what he was thinking. He just started carefully taking apart certain sections of the machine. His hands moved with skill and confidence, like he had done this kind of work many times before. The crowd leaned forward in their chairs, fascinated despite themselves. Even the people who had been getting ready to leave stopped and watched. There was something mesmerizing about seeing someone work with such focus and determination. The young man worked for about 10 minutes without saying a word. He removed panels, disconnected wires, and examined parts that the engineers hadn't even thought to check. Every movement was careful and deliberate. He wasn't randomly taking things apart. He clearly had a plan. Then he stopped and stood up, wiping his hands on a cloth. He looked at the machine thoughtfully, like he was trying to decide something. The engineers moved closer, curious about what he had found. "The problem isn't with the main systems," the teenager said, speaking to everyone but looking directly at the head engineer. "Everything on the computer side is working fine. The issue is in how the new digital controls are talking to the older mechanical parts." The engineers looked at each other with surprise. This wasn't a random guess. The young man was describing a very specific type of problem that only someone with real knowledge would even think about. When you upgraded the control system, the teenager continued, you probably didn't account for the timing differences between the digital signals and the mechanical response time. The computer is trying to make adjustments faster than the physical parts can keep up with. One of the engineers stepped forward, looking interested for the first time. That's actually possible, he admitted. But how would you fix something like that? The young man smiled for the first time since the whole situation started. It wasn't a cocky smile or a show-off grin. It was the smile of someone who genuinely enjoyed solving problems and was excited to share what he had learned. You don't need to rebuild anything, he explained. You just need to add a buffer delay in the control sequence. Let me show you. He knelt down next to the machine's main control panel and started working with wires and connections that looked incredibly complicated to everyone watching. His fingers moved quickly and confidently, making small adjustments that seemed tiny, but were apparently very important. The big boss watched in amazement. Just 20 minutes ago, he had been making fun of this young man. Now the teenager was explaining technical concepts that even impressed the company's own engineers. How was this possible? As the young man worked, he started explaining what he was doing in simple terms that everyone could understand. He talked about how machines were like people in some ways. They needed time to think and respond. When you asked them to do too many things too fast, they got confused and stopped working. It's like when you're driving a car, he said while carefully adjusting some connections. If you slam on the gas and then immediately hit the brakes, the car doesn't know what you want it to do. This machine was getting mixed signals and couldn't figure out how to respond. The engineers were taking notes now, clearly impressed by both the diagnosis and the solution. They realized they had been looking at the problem in completely the wrong way. They had been focused on finding something broken when the real issue was about timing and communication. After working for another few minutes, the young man stood up and stepped back from the machine. He looked at the big boss and said simply, "Try starting it now." The demonstration area was completely silent. Everyone held their breath as the big boss walked over to the control panel. His hand shook slightly as he reached for the start button. If this didn't work, the day would be a complete disaster. If it did work, he would have to face the fact that a teenager had solved a problem that had stumped his entire engineering team. He pressed the button. The machine's engine came to life with a smooth, powerful roar. All the warning lights turned from red to green. The grinding noises were gone, replaced by the steady hum of properly working equipment. Everything was running perfectly. The crowd erupted in applause. People stood up from their chairs, clapping and cheering like they had just watched something amazing happen. The expensive visitors who had been getting ready to leave were now pulling out their phones again, but this time to take pictures and videos of the working machine. The big boss stared at the control panel in shock. All the displays showed normal readings. Every system was operating exactly as it should. The million-dollar machine that had been completely dead just minutes before was now running better than it had during the original demonstration. He looked over at the young man, who was quietly putting the tools back in the toolbox like nothing special had happened. The teenager wasn't trying to take credit or show off. He just looked satisfied that the problem was solved. The head engineer walked over to the young man with a look of genuine respect on his face. "That was incredible," he said. "How did you know to look for that specific problem? That's not something you learn from books." The teenager shrugged modestly. "My dad taught me that when machines act crazy, it's usually because different parts are trying to work at different speeds. You just have to find where the timing is off and give everything a chance to stay in sync." The big boss felt his world turning upside down. This wasn't just luck or a good guess. The young man clearly understood these machines in a way that was deep and real. But how was that possible? Who was this kid and where had he learned so much about advanced farming equipment? As questions started forming in his mind, the big boss realized he didn't even know the young man's name. After everything that had just happened, after being saved from complete disaster, he had never even asked who this person was who had just rescued his entire business presentation. The big boss stood there watching the machine run perfectly, his mind spinning with questions. The sound of the engine was music to his ears, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something incredible had just happened. Something that changed everything about this day and maybe about his whole understanding of the world. He walked over to the young man, who was now standing quietly to the side, watching the machine work with a satisfied look on his face. The teenager seemed completely unbothered by all the attention he was getting. People were pointing at him and whispering, but he acted like fixing million-dollar machines was just another normal day for him. "Hey," the big boss said, his voice much softer than it had been earlier. He felt embarrassed about how he had spoken before, but he was also incredibly curious. "I never got your name. I think I owe you a huge thank you." The young man turned and gave him a friendly smile. "No problem at all," he said. "I'm just glad I could help. My name is Jake, by the way." "Jake?" the big boss repeated, shaking the teenager's hand firmly. "Well, Jake, what you just did was amazing. I've never seen anything like it. My engineers have been working on machines like this for decades, and you figured out the problem in minutes." Jake shrugged, looking a bit uncomfortable with all the praise. "It wasn't that hard once you knew what to look for. These machines are really well built. Sometimes they just need a little help getting all their parts to work together properly." The big boss felt even more curious. This wasn't the way most teenagers talked. Jake spoke about complicated machinery like he had been around it his whole life. His knowledge was clearly deep and real, not something he had just picked up from watching videos or reading books. "Can I ask you something?" the big boss said, looking around at all the expensive visitors who were now taking pictures of the working machine. "How did you learn so much about this stuff? Do you work on farms? Are you in school studying engineering?" Jake smiled and pointed toward the crowd of well-dressed people. "My dad's here somewhere. He's the one who taught me about machines. He always says that understanding how things work is more important than memorizing what books tell you." The big boss felt a strange chill run down his spine. Something about the way Jake said, "my dad," made him pay attention in a way he hadn't before. There was pride in the teenager's voice, but also something else. Like his father was someone special, someone important. "Your dad?" the big boss asked, trying to sound casual but feeling anything but casual inside. "What's his name? Maybe I know him if he works with farm equipment." "His last name is Morrison," Jake said simply. "He's probably talking to some of the other engineers right now. He likes to hear about new developments in the industry." The big boss felt the world stop spinning around him. Morrison. That name hit him like a lightning bolt. His face went white and his hands started shaking slightly. He stared at Jake with wide eyes, suddenly seeing things he hadn't noticed before. There was something familiar about Jake's face, something about the way he approached problems, something about his confidence with machinery. How had he missed it? How had he not seen the connection right away? Dr. Robert Morrison, the legend, the genius, the man whose inventions had changed farming forever, the person who had created the very foundation that the big boss's entire company was built on. And this teenager, this young man he had insulted and dismissed, was his son. The big boss felt sick to his stomach. He had spent years studying Dr. Morrison's work, reading his papers, using his inventions to build a successful business. The man was basically his hero, someone he had always dreamed of meeting, and he had just been incredibly rude to his son. "Morrison," the big boss whispered, more to himself than to Jake. "Your father is Dr. Robert Morrison?" Jake nodded, not understanding why the big boss suddenly looked like he had seen a ghost. "Yeah, do you know him? He's been working on farm equipment for a long time." The big boss couldn't speak for a moment. His mind was racing, trying to process what this meant. Dr. Morrison was here, at his demonstration, watching everything that had happened. The most respected engineer in the farming industry had witnessed him being rude to his own son. But it was worse than that. Much worse. Dr. Morrison had invented the hydraulic system that was in the machine that had just broken down. He had created the basic technology that made modern farming equipment possible. His son had just fixed a problem using principles that his father had pioneered decades ago. The big boss looked around the crowd frantically, searching for a face he had only seen in magazine articles and engineering journals. Dr. Morrison was famous for staying out of the spotlight, preferring to work quietly on his inventions rather than giving speeches or attending big events. Then he saw him, standing near the back of the crowd, watching the demonstration with interest, was a man, in his 50s with gray hair and kind eyes. He was wearing simple clothes, nothing fancy or expensive. He looked like any other visitor, but the big boss knew immediately who he was. Dr. Robert Morrison was watching his son with obvious pride. There was a smile on his face that showed he had seen everything that had happened. He had watched his son solve the problem, heard the rude comments from the big boss, and witnessed the whole dramatic turn of events. The big boss felt his knees getting weak. This was the man whose work he had studied for years, whose inventions had made his success possible, whose ideas had revolutionized farming around the world. And he had just embarrassed himself completely in front of him. But Dr. Morrison didn't look angry. He didn't look upset or offended. Instead, he looked amused and proud, like a father watching his child succeed at something difficult. When he noticed the big boss staring at him, he gave a small wave and started walking over. The big boss wanted to run away and hide. He wanted to disappear and pretend this whole day had never happened. Instead, he stood frozen as one of his biggest heroes approached him with a calm, friendly expression. "That was quite a demonstration," Dr. Morrison said when he reached them, his voice warm and without any hint of anger. "I have to say, that was one of the most interesting equipment failures I've seen in years. Very educational." The big boss opened his mouth to apologize, to explain, to somehow make up for his earlier behavior, but no words came out. He just stood there staring at the man who had inspired so much of his career. Dr. Morrison seemed to understand his confusion. "Don't worry about it," he said with a gentle smile. "Jake is used to people underestimating him. It happens all the time. Most people see a teenager in work clothes and assume he doesn't know anything about complex machinery." Jake laughed and shook his head. "Dad, you should have seen the look on everyone's faces when the machine started working again. I thought some of those engineers were going to faint." The big boss finally found his voice, but it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Dr. Morrison, I had no idea. I'm so sorry for what I said earlier. I was frustrated and embarrassed, but that's no excuse for being rude to your son." Dr. Morrison waved away the apology. "Jake can handle himself just fine. Besides, he got to show off his skills and help solve an interesting problem. I'd say it worked out pretty well for everyone." The big boss looked back and forth between father and son, seeing the similarities he had missed before. They both had the same calm confidence, the same way of looking at problems like they were puzzles to be solved rather than obstacles to be afraid of. "But I don't understand," the big boss said, still trying to process everything that had happened. "Jake, how did you learn to work on machines like this? This isn't basic farm equipment, this is advanced technology." Dr. Morrison smiled proudly at his son. "Jake has been helping me in my workshop since he was old enough to hold a wrench. He's always been more interested in how things work than in sitting in classrooms. I've been teaching him engineering principles his whole life, but he learns best by getting his hands dirty." Jake nodded enthusiastically. "Dad always says that you can't really understand a machine until you've taken it apart and put it back together. Books are great, but they can't teach you what it feels like when something isn't working right." The big boss felt a wave of understanding wash over him. This wasn't just luck or natural talent. Jake had been getting the best engineering education possible, taught by one of the greatest minds in the field. He had grown up surrounded by cutting-edge technology and brilliant insights. But there was something else, something that made this situation even more incredible. Dr. Morrison's inventions were the foundation of the machine that had broken down. His son had just fixed a problem using technology that his father had originally created. It was like watching history come full circle. The crowd was still celebrating around them, but the big boss felt like he was in a bubble with just these two amazing people. He looked at Dr. Morrison with new respect, and at Jake with something close to awe. "Dr. Morrison," he said, his voice filled with genuine admiration, "I've been studying your work for years. Your inventions made my entire company possible. I can't believe you're here. And I can't believe I almost missed the chance to meet you because I was too proud to see what was right in front of me." Dr. Morrison's eyes twinkled with amusement. "Well," he said, "I guess that makes this a day of learning for everyone." The big boss stood there feeling like his whole world had been turned upside down. Here he was, face to face with the man whose work had inspired his entire career, and that man's son had just saved his business from complete disaster. The weight of what had happened was starting to sink in, and it was almost too much to handle. Dr. Morrison seemed to notice his discomfort and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You know," he said with a kind smile, "I've been in this industry for over 30 years, and I've learned that the best lessons often come from the most unexpected situations." The big boss looked around at the crowd of visitors who were still amazed by what they had witnessed. Some were taking videos of the working machine, others were asking the engineers questions about what had just happened. The whole atmosphere had changed from disappointment and frustration to excitement and wonder. But the big boss couldn't shake the feeling that he had learned something much more important than just how to fix a broken machine. Something about himself, about how he treated people, about what really mattered in business and in life. "Dr. Morrison," he said, his voice filled with genuine emotion, "I need to apologize not just to you, but to Jake, and honestly to everyone here. What I said earlier was wrong on so many levels. I let my frustration and pride get in the way of basic human decency." Jake looked surprised by the serious tone in the big boss's voice. "Hey, it's really okay," he said. "People say stuff when they're stressed. I've heard way worse things than that." But the big boss shook his head firmly. "No, it's not okay. And the fact that you're being so understanding about it just makes me feel worse about my behavior." He turned to face the crowd and walked over to the microphone that was still set up from the original presentation. The visitors looked up, wondering what was going to happen next. The big boss took a deep breath and began to speak, his voice carrying clearly across the demonstration area. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I need to tell you all something important. A few minutes ago, when our machine broke down, I made a comment that I'm deeply ashamed of. I was frustrated and embarrassed, and I took that out on a young man who was just here to learn and observe." The crowd grew quiet, sensing that something significant was about to happen. The big boss continued, his voice growing stronger and more confident as he spoke. "That young man, Jake, not only proved me completely wrong by fixing our machine when our own engineers couldn't, but he did it with grace, skill, and kindness that I clearly didn't deserve. And now I've learned something that makes my behavior even more inexcusable." He gestured toward Jake and Dr. Morrison, who were standing together near the machine. Jake is the son of Dr. Robert Morrison, one of the most respected engineers in our industry. Dr. Morrison's inventions are the foundation of the technology we use every day, including the machine you see working perfectly behind me. A murmur went through the crowd as people realized the significance of what they were hearing. Some of the visitors clearly recognized Dr. Morrison's name and understood what this meant. "But here's the thing," the big boss continued. "Even if Jake had been exactly who I thought he was, just a regular farm kid with no special connections, my behavior would have still been wrong. Everyone deserves to be treated with respect, regardless of their age, their clothes, or what we assume about their background." Dr. Morrison was watching with approval, clearly impressed by the big boss's willingness to admit his mistakes publicly. Jake looked a bit embarrassed by all the attention, but there was respect in his eyes as he listened to the apology. The big boss wasn't finished. "This experience has taught me something crucial about leadership, about business, and about life. We live in a world where we're quick to judge people based on appearances, where we assume that expensive clothes and fancy titles are the only signs of value and intelligence." He paused, looking directly at Jake. "Today, a teenager in work boots showed me and all of us that real knowledge, real skill, and real character have nothing to do with how someone looks or how old they are. Jake solved a problem that stumped our entire engineering team, and he did it with humility and professionalism that put us all to shame." The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. This wasn't the kind of speech anyone had expected to hear at a machine demonstration, but somehow it felt more important than any sales presentation could have been. "I want to make this right," the big boss said, looking at Jake with genuine respect. Jake, I know you're still in school, but I would be honored if you would consider working with us. Not just as a summer job or an internship, but as a real member of our engineering team. We clearly have a lot to learn from you. Jake looked surprised and glanced at his father, who nodded encouragingly. That's very generous, Jake said. But I still have a lot to learn myself. Maybe we could work something out where I could help. Part-time while I continue my education. Dr. Morrison stepped forward with a smile. Actually, I think this might be a perfect opportunity for both Jake and your company. I've been looking for ways to pass on some of the knowledge I've gained over the years. Maybe we could arrange something where Jake works with your team while I consult on some of your more challenging technical problems. The big boss felt his heart skip a beat. Having Dr. Morrison as a consultant would be like having access to decades of revolutionary engineering knowledge. It was an opportunity he had never even dreamed of. Are you serious? He asked, hardly able to believe what he was hearing. You would be willing to work with us? Dr. Morrison chuckled. I'm always interested in working with people who are willing to learn and grow. What happened here today shows me that your company has the kind of leadership that can admit mistakes and make changes. That's exactly the kind of organization I want to support. The crowd burst into applause, and the big boss felt tears starting to form in his eyes. What had started as the worst day of his career was turning into something incredible, something that would change his company and his life forever. But the transformation wasn't just about business opportunities. As the big boss looked around, at all the faces watching him, he realized that something fundamental had shifted inside him. He had always thought of himself as a good leader, someone who treated people fairly and with respect. But today had shown him that he still had blind spots, still had areas where his assumptions and prejudices could get in the way of his values. Over the following weeks, the big boss implemented changes in his company that went far beyond just hiring Jake and consulting with Dr. Morrison. He created new policies to ensure that everyone who visited the company, regardless of their appearance or background, would be treated with dignity and respect. He established a program to identify and nurture young talent from all backgrounds, recognizing that brilliance could come from anywhere, and often appeared in unexpected forms. He changed the company's hiring practices to focus more on problem-solving ability and character, rather than just credentials and experience. Most importantly, he made it a point to regularly remind himself and his employees that assumptions about people based on their appearance were not just wrong, but harmful to everyone involved. The company began to attract diverse talent from all backgrounds, leading to more creative solutions and better products. Jake proved to be everything the big boss had hoped for and more. His fresh perspective and deep understanding of both traditional farming and modern technology helped the company develop innovative solutions that their competitors couldn't match. He brought an enthusiasm and creativity that energized the entire engineering team. Dr. Morrison's consulting work led to breakthrough developments that revolutionized several of the company's product lines. His decades of experience, combined with his son's intuitive understanding of practical applications, created a perfect combination of wisdom and innovation. But perhaps the most significant change was in the big boss himself. He became known throughout the industry not just as a successful businessman, but as a leader who genuinely cared about people and who had the courage to admit his mistakes and learn from them. The story of what happened that day spread throughout the farming community and beyond. It became a powerful example of how prejudice and assumptions can blind us to the talents and contributions of others, and how true leadership requires the humility to acknowledge our mistakes and the wisdom to learn from them. Years later, when people asked the big boss about the turning point in his career, he would always tell them about the day a teenager in work clothes taught him the most important lesson of his life. The lesson that respect, kindness, and open-mindedness aren't just nice ideals to talk about, but essential tools for success in business and in life. The machine that had broken down that day continued to work perfectly for years afterward, but it became more than just a piece of equipment. It became a symbol of what could happen when people were willing to look beyond surface appearances and recognize the value in every person they encountered. And every time the big boss saw that machine running in the field, he remembered the day when his assumptions were shattered, and his life was changed by a young man who showed him that wisdom and skill have nothing to do with age, appearance, or expectations, and everything to do with character, knowledge, and the willingness to help others succeed.